The whip cracked like thunder in the pre-dawn darkness, and Solomon Carter counted. 1, 2, 3. Each lash carved another piece from his soul, another fragment of the boy who once believed in mercy, the leather bit deep into skin that had already forgotten what kindness felt like, and still he counted. 17, 18, 19. Because counting was the only thing left that belonged to him. August 12th, 1851. Magnolia Grove Plantation, Georgia. The cotton bloomed white as bone under a merciless sun and in the shadow of Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds. Solomon Carter learned what it meant to be prey, not to the overseer's whip, not to the endless hours in blazing fields, but to something far more dangerous, to his master's obsession. Master Edmund Caldwell stood watching from the big house porch, his pale eyes following Solomon's every movement with the intensity of a hawk studying wounded game. 23 years old and beautiful in ways that made grown men forget their prayers, Solomon had become the center of an attention that felt like slow poison in his veins. The counting stopped at 25. The whipping post fell silent. Solomon's knees hit dirt that had drunk the blood of generations, but his eyes never closed, never looked away from the man who owned him. In those green depths, something flickered. Not submission, not fear, something sharper, hungrier, more patient than either. "Clean him up." Master Caldwell's voice drifted across the yard, soft as silk, cold as winter wind. "Bring him to the house when the bleeding stops." Solomon's breath caught. The house meant privacy. Privacy meant whatever lived behind those calculating eyes would finally show its teeth. He'd felt it building for months. The way conversations died when he entered rooms. The way the master's fingers lingered when counting coins into his palm. The way other slaves stepped aside when he passed, their faces carrying the weight of knowledge they couldn't speak. "That boy walking toward something dark," old Mama Ruth had whispered one evening, her blind eyes seeing more than most. "Master got a sickness in him, and it's got Solomon's name written on it." She was right. Solomon had seen it in the ledgers. He wasn't supposed to read entries in the master's careful script. S. Carter, special handling required, private quarters recommended, discipline to be administered personally. The master's obsession had grown like cancer, eating through reason, through the thin pretense of civilization that separated men from monsters. It whispered in shadowed hallways, breathed in locked rooms, reached for Solomon with hands that trembled with more than just power. In the slave quarters, children played games of master and servant, but they always stopped when Solomon approached. They'd seen the hunger in Caldwell's eyes, heard the things whispered after midnight. They knew what special attention meant on plantations where screams echoed through magnolia groves. Solomon pushed himself to his feet, dirt clinging to wounds that would heal into new scars, new reminders of what he was to these people. Property, possession, plaything. But in the space between heartbeats as blood ran down his back like baptismal water, something else stirred in his chest. Not acceptance, not surrender, purpose. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across fields where his ancestors had bled and died, where his mother had labored until her heart gave out, where his sister had disappeared into the master's house one night and never returned. The cotton swayed in humid breeze, each plant a witness to horrors that would never see justice, unless justice made itself. Solomon walked toward the slave quarters, feeling the weight of watching eyes. Master Caldwell still stood on his porch, fingers drumming against white-painted railings, planning whatever came next. The obsession had teeth now. It had hunger. It had plans that would break Solomon's spirit the way it had broken so many others. But obsessions cut both ways. And sometimes, when a man stared too long into darkness, the darkness learned to stare back. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you from and what time is it there? Don't forget to subscribe. That evening, as Solomon sat on his straw mattress cleaning blood from his wounds, he made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his sister's diary. The pages told a story of systematic horror of a master whose appetites grew darker with each passing season. The last entry was dated 3 days before she vanished. He says I'm special. Says he's going to keep me close. God help me, I know what that means. Solomon closed the diary with hands that no longer shook. In his chest, something cold and patient began to grow. Not rage. Rage was wild, uncontrolled, easily broken. This was something sharper, more precise, more deadly. Master Caldwell's obsession had created its own destroyer. This is the true story of Solomon Carter, the young enslaved man whose soul was shattered by relentless cruelty, and whose silence could no longer bear the weight of his master's obsession. While the master's house gleamed with polished brass and fine china, Solomon Carter's world was shrinking, one obsessive command at a time. The plantation spread across 3,000 acres of Georgia red clay, but for Solomon it had become as small as the space between Edmund Caldwell's pale eyes and his own reflection in them. Magnolia Grove had once been Solomon's entire universe, but not like this. As a child, he'd run through cotton fields with bare feet, chasing butterflies while his mother sang spirituals that made the very air vibrate with hope. He'd learned to read by candlelight in the slave quarters, his sister Mary holding stolen books while he traced letters with fingers still small enough to dream. Those days felt like someone else's memories now. The transformation had begun 3 years ago, the morning after Solomon's 20th birthday. He'd been working the stables, brushing down Master Caldwell's prize stallion, when the master appeared in the doorway. Something in the man's expression had shifted that day. A recognition, a claiming, a decision that would poison everything that followed. "You've grown into something remarkable," Caldwell had said, his voice carrying undertones that made Solomon's skin crawl. "Time we discussed your future." The future, it turned out, involved moving Solomon from the quarters to a small room behind the kitchen, closer to the house, closer to supervision, closer to whatever hunger lived behind the master's increasingly frequent visits. "It's for your own good," Caldwell explained, his hand resting on Solomon's shoulder with false paternal warmth. "A boy with your qualities needs careful guidance, special attention. Special attention meant private lessons in deportment, hours spent learning to serve tea with perfect posture while the master watched every movement with scientific intensity. It meant new clothes, finer than anything Solomon had owned, garments that fit too well, showed too much, made him feel like a doll being dressed for display. "Beautiful," Caldwell would murmur during these sessions, adjusting Solomon's collar with fingers that lingered too long. "Absolutely beautiful." The other slaves saw the changes and understood what Solomon was still learning to accept. Mama Ruth, blind since birth but seeing more than most, pulled him aside one evening with hands that shook with more than age. "That man's sickness got a name," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the cricket song. "It feeds on pretty things, young things, breaks them slow, piece by piece, till there ain't nothing left but what he wants to see." Solomon had tried to resist at first. Small rebellions, missed appointments, imperfect posture, eyes that wouldn't stay downcast when commanded. Each defiance earned punishment that went beyond physical pain. Caldwell had perfected psychological warfare using isolation, humiliation, and carefully calibrated kindness to break down Solomon's sense of self. "You disappoint me," became the master's favorite phrase, delivered with a sadness so theatrical it might have been comical if the consequences weren't so devastating. "After everything I've given you, all the opportunities, the elevation above your station, this is how you repay my generosity?" The generosity included a wardrobe of silk shirts and tailored trousers, meals taken in the master's private dining room, while other slaves ate cornbread and fatback in the quarters. Books, real books, not the smuggled primers he'd learned from as a child. All of it came with strings attached, invisible chains that tightened with each gift accepted. The master's study became Solomon's prison. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls, speaking of philosophy and religion while horror played out beneath their scholarly gaze. Here, Caldwell would hold forth on natural hierarchy, divine providence, the burden of civilizing lesser races, all while his eyes devoured Solomon's face with an appetite that had nothing to do with salvation. "You're not like the others," he'd say, his voice taking on the fervor of a preacher describing paradise. "There's something refined in you, something that responds to proper cultivation. You could be extraordinary, Solomon, my greatest achievement." Achievement, as if Solomon's humanity was a project to be completed, a masterpiece to be shaped by the master's twisted vision. The breaking came in stages. First, the erosion of privacy. Doors that couldn't be locked, windows that faced the master's study, schedules that ensured Solomon was never truly alone. Then came the touching, casual at first, hands on shoulders during lessons, fingers adjusting his posture, embraces that lasted too long and left him feeling soiled. Affection, Caldwell called it, the natural bond between mentor and protege. "Don't be ashamed of what you feel, Solomon. It's beautiful in its own way." But Solomon felt nothing beautiful. Only the slow death of everything he'd once been, replaced by something that existed solely for the master's pleasure. His laughter disappeared first, then his songs. Finally, his ability to meet his own eyes in mirrors or still water. Other slaves began avoiding him, not from cruelty, but from a survival instinct that recognized contagion when they saw it. He'd become the master's creature, marked by an obsession that stained everything it touched. Even his sister Mary, before she vanished, had looked at him with eyes full of pity and fear. "You got to fight it somehow," she'd whispered during their last conversation. "Don't let him take everything." But fighting seemed impossible when the master controlled every aspect of his existence. Food, shelter, clothing, human contact. All of it filtered through Caldwell's twisted vision of ownership. The man had turned love into weaponry, kindness into chains, attention into suffocation. The house itself became complicit in Solomon's destruction. Every room held memories of degradation disguised as privilege. The dining room where he'd been forced to eat while the master watched every bite, commenting on his appetite, his manners, his beauty. The library where hours were spent in enforced proximity, breathing the same air, existing as decoration for Caldwell's intellectual pretensions. "You're mine," the master would say during their evening sessions, his voice soft with satisfaction. "Every breath, every thought, every beat of your heart belongs to me." Isn't that comforting? To know your place so completely? Solomon learned to nod, to smile, to perform gratitude for his own destruction. He became an actor in a play he'd never auditioned for, speaking lines written by a madman's obsession. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, until he could barely remember who he'd been before the master's attention had fallen on him like a shadow. The mirrors in the house showed a stranger now, someone beautiful in the way objects were beautiful, perfectly maintained but somehow lifeless. His reflection had become a ghost, haunting spaces where his authentic self had once lived. That night, as Solomon stared at his reflection in the water barrel, he saw nothing. The boy who once dreamed had vanished, replaced by whatever his master's obsession demanded him to be. The first act of defiance was so small, the master didn't notice. Solomon moved one item in the study, just an inch to the left. A brass letter opener shifted from its precise position beside the inkwell. It was nothing. It was everything. For 3 months, Solomon had been the perfect puppet, strings pulled by Edmund Caldwell's obsessive hands. But perfection, he discovered, was its own kind of prison. And prisons always had weaknesses if you looked hard enough. The letter opener became his first teacher. Each morning he studied its placement, memorizing the master's routines with the precision of a cartographer mapping enemy territory. Caldwell arranged his desk the same way every day. Ink on the right, paper centered, the brass blade at exactly 30 degrees to the leather writing pad. Obsessive order from an obsessive mind. When Solomon moved it that first time, his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Such a small rebellion, barely visible, but it felt like revolution. He watched from the corner of his eye as the master entered the study for morning correspondence. Saw the momentary pause as Caldwell's gaze fixed on the displaced object. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the room. Solomon kept his expression neutral, submissive, while something wild and dangerous unfurled in his chest. The master frowned, corrected the letter opener's position, and continued his routine. But a seed had been planted. The punishment came that evening, swift and surgical. "You seem distracted today," Caldwell observed during their private dinner, his voice carrying that familiar undertone of disappointed affection. "Perhaps you need a reminder of your position." Solomon spent the night locked in the root cellar, surrounded by the smell of moldering vegetables and his own fear. But when dawn came and the master released him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Not defeat, determination. The second attempt came a week later. This time, Solomon rearranged 3 items: the letter opener, a glass paperweight, and a leather journal. Small changes, subtle enough to plant doubt in the master's mind without triggering immediate suspicion. Was someone entering his private space? Was his memory failing? Was his perfect control slipping? Caldwell's response revealed more than his punishment. The man became hyper-vigilant, checking his study multiple times throughout the day, asking pointed questions about household staff, installing new locks on doors that had never needed them. His obsession with Solomon intensified, but it carried new flavors now. Uncertainty, suspicion, fear. "I've been thinking about your loyalty," the master said during one of their evening sessions, his fingers drumming against the desk where Solomon's small rebellions had taken root. "Wondering if perhaps I've been too lenient, too trusting." Solomon met his gaze directly for the first time in months. "I live to serve you, master. You know that." The words were true in their way. He did live to serve, but perhaps not in the manner Caldwell imagined. The psychological chess game escalated. Solomon began varying his responses to the master's demands, sometimes complying perfectly, other times introducing tiny flaws that could be attributed to human error rather than deliberate defiance. A wine glass placed slightly askew, a book returned to the wrong shelf. Timing disrupted by mere seconds, each imperfection ate at Caldwell's need for absolute control. The man who had rebuilt Solomon's identity piece by piece found his own certainty crumbling. Was his prized possession becoming defective? Had the careful conditioning failed? Was the beautiful broken boy he'd created learning to think for himself? "You're different lately," Caldwell observed one evening, his voice tight with frustration. Distant, almost willful. Solomon allowed confusion to cloud his features. "I don't understand, master." "I do everything you ask." Yes, but the master struggled to articulate what he sensed. It's not the same. Something's changed. Something had changed. With each small victory, each moment of successful deception, Solomon was rebuilding himself from the inside out. Not the boy he'd been before. That innocence was gone forever. But something harder, sharper, more purposeful. The third attempt nearly destroyed him. Solomon decided to test bigger boundaries, to push against the psychological walls Caldwell had constructed around him. During their evening meal, he asked a question that had been burning in his mind for months. "Master, what happened to my sister Mary?" The silence that followed was deafening. Caldwell's fork paused halfway to his mouth, wineglass trembling in his grip. When he looked at Solomon, his pale eyes held storms that promised devastation. "Your sister?" The master's voice was silk wrapped around steel. "Why would you ask about her?" Solomon kept his expression innocent, curious. "I miss her, that's all. I wondered if she was happy in her new position." The beating that followed was methodical, calculated to cause maximum pain without permanent damage. Caldwell used a leather strap, counting each blow aloud while lecturing Solomon about appropriate topics of conversation, boundaries of questioning, the danger of curiosity in creatures like him. But even as pain exploded across his back, Solomon counted something else. The tremor in the master's voice, the defensive edge to his justifications, the way he avoided direct answers about Mary's fate. Information was power, and Solomon was learning to collect it. Recovery from the beating took a week. During those 7 days of enforced bed rest, Solomon had time to think, to plan, to understand what he was truly facing. The master's obsession wasn't just about possession, it was about perfection. Caldwell had rebuilt Solomon into an idealized version of ownership, but ideals were fragile things. They cracked under pressure. More importantly, Solomon realized he wasn't alone in his suffering. Other slaves had noticed the changes in household routines, the master's increasing instability, the way fear now seasoned every interaction. During whispered conversations and shadowed corners, he began gathering intelligence. "Master been acting strange," confirmed Josiah, who worked the stables, talking to himself, checking locks that don't need checking. Something got him spooked. From the kitchen staff, Solomon learned about Mary's final weeks. The screaming that came from the master's private rooms, the bloody sheets that required cleaning, the grave that appeared in the family cemetery without ceremony or explanation. "She fought him," whispered Sarah, who'd laundered those sheets. "Fought till the end, made him work for what he took." The knowledge should have broken Solomon's spirit completely. Instead, it forged it into something unbreakable. Mary had resisted. She'd made her murderer pay a price, even if the ultimate cost was her life. She'd shown him a path. Solomon began preparing systematically, not for escape. That was impossible under Caldwell's vigilant obsession. Not for rescue. No help would come from a world that sanctioned his suffering. He prepared for war. The master's study became his classroom. While pretending submission during their evening sessions, Solomon memorized every detail. The location of keys, the weight of potential weapons, the master's physical habits and limitations. Caldwell was strong but soft, accustomed to inflicting violence rather than receiving it. His hands were smooth, uncalloused, weak from a lifetime of others doing his physical labor. Most importantly, Solomon studied the obsession itself, learning to read its rhythms and requirements. The master needed complete control, perfect submission, absolute adoration. He fed on Solomon's brokenness like a vampire feeding on blood. But what happened when the food source became poison? Solomon began the delicate work of reshaping himself again, not into Caldwell's vision of perfection, but into something far more dangerous. He maintained the surface compliance while building strength beneath. Physical exercises hidden as cleaning routines, mental conditioning disguised as meditation, emotional walls constructed behind masks of obedience. The master noticed nothing. His obsession had blinded him to everything except his own reflection in Solomon's eyes. He saw what he wanted to see, believed what he needed to believe, trusted in the completeness of his victory. That trust would kill him. Late at night, when the house slept and even the master's vigilance relaxed, Solomon practiced. Movement without sound, breathing without detection, thinking without revelation. He was becoming something unprecedented, a weapon forged in the fires of systematic destruction, tempered by rage that had learned patience. The broken pieces of Solomon Carter weren't just healing. They were becoming weapons. The storm that had been building in Solomon's chest for months finally found its voice on a night when rain lashed the windows of Magnolia Grove like tears the sky could no longer contain. He sat in the master's study, candlelight dancing across his face as Edmund Caldwell droned on about divine providence and natural order, the same sermon that always preceded the worst nights. "You understand now, don't you?" the master asked, his pale eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he poured himself another brandy. "Your place in the grand design. How lucky you are to serve such a higher purpose." Solomon nodded, keeping his expression peaceful, submissive. Inside, he counted heartbeats, measured distances, calculated angles. The brass letter opener lay exactly where it belonged, 30 degrees from parallel, sharp enough to open letters, sharp enough to open veins. "I understand perfectly." "Master," Solomon said, and for the first time in months, he spoke absolute truth. The transformation began slowly, like dawn breaking over blood-soaked fields. Solomon rose from his chair with fluid grace, movements liquid and purposeful. For 3 months he'd been rebuilding himself in secret, forge-hardening his spirit while maintaining the facade of broken compliance. Tonight the mask would finally fall. "Where are you going?" Caldwell's voice carried a note of uncertainty as Solomon approached the desk. "I didn't dismiss you." Solomon smiled, and there was nothing submissive in it anymore. "No, master." "You didn't." The brass letter opener felt warm in his palm, alive with possibility. He'd held it 100 times while cleaning, polishing it to gleaming perfection while Caldwell watched and lectured. Now it sang a different song entirely, sharper, hungrier, more honest than any prayer. "Solomon." The master's voice cracked like ice under spring sun. For the first time in their twisted relationship, Edmund Caldwell saw something in his possession's eyes that he didn't recognize. Something that refused to be owned. "Do you want to know what happened to Mary?" Solomon asked conversationally, testing the letter opener's weight against his palm. "Your last special project?" Caldwell's face went corpse pale. "I don't know what you're talking about. She's buried behind the rose garden. Shallow grave, quicklime to speed decomposition. You kept her dress, didn't you? Hidden in your bedroom armoire, wrapped in tissue paper like a holy relic." The brandy glass slipped from nerveless fingers, crystal exploding against hardwood in a shower of amber and light. Caldwell lurched to his feet, chair scraping against floor, but Solomon was already moving. 3 months of careful observation had taught him everything about the master's physical limitations. Soft hands, weak reflexes, muscles grown flaccid from a lifetime of others doing his violence. "She fought you," Solomon continued, circling the desk like a predator stalking wounded prey. "Made you work for every violation. That's why you broke her jaw, isn't it? To stop the screaming?" "You don't understand," Caldwell stammered, backing toward the door. "She was sick, uncontrollable. I tried to help her, to guide her like I guided you. But she wouldn't listen, wouldn't learn." The letter opener found his throat with surgical precision, just deep enough to draw blood, shallow enough to keep him conscious. Caldwell's eyes went wide with shock, with disbelief, with the dawning realization that his perfect possession had developed a will of its own. "She did learn," Solomon whispered against the master's ear. She learned that some cages can only be opened from the inside. The cut across Caldwell's throat was deliberate, controlled, designed to terrify rather than kill. Blood ran down his neck in crimson rivulets, staining the white collar that had always been so perfectly pressed, so immaculately maintained. Symbol of civilization destroyed by the very hands that had served it. "Please," Caldwell gasped, his voice reduced to a wheeze. "I gave you everything. Education, refinement, elevation above your station. I made you beautiful." "You made me into a ghost," Solomon replied, his voice carrying the accumulated weight of every violated night, every forced smile, every moment when he'd been required to thank his destroyer for the privilege of being destroyed. "But ghosts can be dangerous things, Master. They remember everything." The second cut opened the Master's palm, severing tendons with anatomical precision. Solomon had learned anatomy from the very books Caldwell had provided, knowledge gifted unknowingly from predator to prey. The hand that had touched him, violated him, claimed ownership over his flesh, would never close properly again. Caldwell crumpled to his knees, cradling the ruined hand against his chest. Blood soaked through his silk shirt, spreading like original sin across fabric that had cost more than most slaves earned in a lifetime. The symmetry was perfect. The man who had bled others finally bleeding himself. "You want to know what I learned during our time together?" Solomon asked, kneeling beside his former master, the letter opener dancing between his fingers like a conductor's baton. "I learned that monsters aren't born, they're created. And creators should always fear their creations." The psychological torture that followed was artful in its precision. Solomon used every technique Caldwell had perfected against him. Isolation, humiliation, the slow erosion of dignity disguised as kindness. He spoke in the Master's own voice, mimicking the cadences and justifications that had accompanied months of systematic destruction. "This is for your own good," Solomon murmured as he bound Caldwell's wrists with silk ties from his own dressing gown. "A man with your appetites needs careful guidance, special attention." The irony was lost on neither of them. Master becomes slave, owner become owned, predator become prey. The natural order Caldwell had preached about so fervently revealed its true face. Not divine hierarchy, but simple survival, red in tooth and claw. But Solomon's revenge required more than role reversal. It demanded complete destruction of everything the Master had built, starting with the psychological architecture of superiority that had enabled such cruelty. "Tell me about the others," Solomon commanded, pressing the blade's edge against Caldwell's cheek. "The boys before Mary, before me. How many graves hide behind your rose garden?" The confession that followed was a catalog of horrors spanning decades. Names without faces, faces without graves, children consumed by an appetite that grew stronger with each feeding. Caldwell spoke through blood and tears, his voice breaking as he detailed atrocities that would never see earthly justice. But Solomon was earthly justice now, carved from suffering and tempered by rage that had learned patience. Each name Caldwell spoke earned another cut, another carefully calculated wound that would heal badly if it healed at all. The Master's flesh became a map of his sins, coordinates marked in blood and pain. "Enough," Caldwell finally gasped, his voice barely audible. "Please, enough. I'll give you anything. Freedom, money, passage north." "Just stop," Solomon paused, considering. "Freedom? You mean the freedom to carry these scars forever? The freedom to wake up screaming from dreams you planted in my head? The freedom to flinch every time someone touches me without warning?" He traced the letter opener along Caldwell's jawline, drawing a thin line that mirrored the scar he'd given Mary before breaking her completely. "There's only one freedom that matters now, Master. The freedom that comes from knowing you'll never hurt another child." The final cut was swift, merciful compared to everything that had preceded it. Solomon had learned precision during his months of servitude, had studied anatomy in the very books Caldwell provided. He knew exactly where to place the blade for a quick death, despite the part of him that screamed for prolonged suffering. Edmund Caldwell died with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in candlelight. His last sight was Solomon's face, no longer beautiful in the passive way he'd cultivated, but terrible in its newfound strength. The face of justice served cold and patient and absolutely final. Solomon sat back on his heels, studying his work. The master's study looked different now, not a place of learning and refinement, but a crime scene, a testament to what happened when obsession met its match. Blood soaked into Persian rugs, stained leather-bound books, transformed elegant furniture into evidence of necessary violence. Outside, thunder rolled across the plantation like the voice of God passing judgment. Rain continued its relentless assault on windows that had witnessed too much, seen too much, kept too many secrets. But secrets had a way of surfacing eventually, especially when written in blood. Solomon cleaned the letter opener with methodical care, wiping away every trace of Caldwell's blood until the brass gleamed like new. He placed it back on the desk at exactly 30 degrees from parallel, maintaining the obsessive order even in chaos. Some habits died hard, but Edmund Caldwell had died harder. The transformation was complete. The broken boy who had entered this room months ago was gone forever, replaced by something both more and less than human. Solomon Carter stood among the ruins of his former prison, breathing air that no longer tasted of submission. His hands finally clean despite the blood they'd spilled. Outside, dawn was breaking over Magnolia Grove. A new day was coming, and Solomon would meet it as himself. Scarred but unbroken, violated but victorious, forever changed, but finally free. The morning light found Solomon Carter standing in his master's study, surrounded by the wreckage of an obsession. What had broken him now lay broken at his feet. Edmund Caldwell's body sprawled across Persian rugs that drank his blood like thirsty earth, while Solomon stood above him with hands that no longer trembled, eyes that no longer looked away. The brass letter opener rested on the desk at precisely 30 degrees, spotless and gleaming. Perfect order maintained even in chaos, the final irony of a man who had demanded absolute control until control itself killed him. Solomon felt nothing. Not triumph, not guilt, not the wild euphoria he'd expected after months of careful planning. Just emptiness where the master's obsession had lived. A hollow space that might someday fill with something resembling peace. He studied Caldwell's face, slack in death, stripped of the hunger that had defined their relationship. Just meat now, cooling in the dawn air. The house breathed differently around him. Walls that had witnessed systematic horror now held a different kind of silence. Not the oppressive quiet of hidden suffering, but the clean emptiness that follows necessary violence. Rooms that had echoed with Solomon's forced gratitude now absorbed his first genuine breath of freedom. He walked through the mansion like a ghost, touring his former haunts. The dining room where he'd been displayed like prized artwork. The library where Caldwell had lectured him about natural hierarchy while planning unnatural crimes. Each space carried memories that would never fully fade, but they no longer had power over him. The victim was dead. The survivor remained. In the kitchen, Sarah was preparing breakfast, her weathered hands working bread dough with practiced efficiency. She looked up when Solomon entered, her eyes taking in his blood-stained clothes, his eerily calm expression, the way he moved like a man who had finally laid down an impossible burden. "It's finished?" she asked quietly. Solomon nodded. "It's finished." She returned to her kneading, neither approving nor condemning. In a world where justice was a luxury slaves couldn't afford, Sometimes men had to make their own. What you gonna do now? Solomon considered the question. Freedom was a foreign concept after months of absolute control, like trying to remember a language he'd spoken in childhood. The plantation stretched around him in all directions, 3,000 acres of red clay and human misery. North lay the promise of true freedom, but also the certainty of pursuit. West meant deeper into slave territory, more masters, more obsessions waiting to be born. I'm going to bury her properly, he said finally. Mary deserves better than quicklime and shame. Sarah's hand stilled on the dough. Behind the rose garden? Yes. Solomon's voice carried new authority, the confidence of a man who had faced the worst darkness and emerged intact. She'll have a real grave with her name carved in stone. Let the world know Mary Carter lived and died and mattered. The news spread through the slave quarters like wildfire jumping from tree to tree. Whispered conversations carried fragments of truth mixed with speculation, fact blended with hope. The master was dead. His special boy had killed him. The big house stood empty, its owner's blood soaking into floors that had never known justice. Some slaves fled immediately, vanishing into Georgia swampland before authorities could arrive. Others stayed, paralyzed by the magnitude of change, unable to imagine existence beyond the plantation's boundaries. A few began planning, quietly gathering supplies for journeys they'd only dreamed about during the darkest nights. Solomon helped where he could, sharing information about roads and safe houses that Mary had whispered to him during their final conversations. But he made no attempt to organize or lead. His war had been personal, his victory solitary. Others would have to find their own paths to freedom. By afternoon, riders appeared on the horizon. Sheriff Morrison arrived with a posse of 12 men, their faces grim with the knowledge that news of a slave killing his master would spread like plague if not contained quickly. They found Caldwell's body exactly where Solomon had left it. Blood congealed, eyes staring at nothing, the brass letter opener placed with obsessive precision. They found Solomon in the rose garden, digging Mary's grave with a shovel that had probably buried other victims. He didn't run when they called his name, didn't resist when they bound his hands with rope that cut into wrists still scarred from months of different restraints. You killed him, Sheriff Morrison stated. More observation than accusation. Yes, Solomon replied without hesitation. I killed him. The trial was a formality, justice performed for an audience that had already decided the outcome. Solomon stood in chains before a judge who had dined at Caldwell's table, listened to testimony from men who had enabled the master's crimes through willful blindness. He spoke no words in his own defense, offered no justification beyond simple truth. He destroyed children, Solomon said when asked for final words. Someone had to stop him. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn. Solomon received it with the same calm he'd shown throughout the proceedings, as if judgment had already been passed by a higher court than any earthly tribunal could convene. That night, in his cell, he carved Mary's name into the stone wall with a piece of broken iron. Beneath it, he scratched his own, not as memorialization, but as testimony. Future generations would find these marks and wonder about the lives they represented, the prices they'd paid, the justice they'd claimed. Dawn came gray and drizzling, appropriate weather for an execution that would be remembered long after the participants were dust. Solomon walked to the gallows with steady steps, refusing the hood, declining the preacher's final prayer. He looked out over the crowd that had gathered to witness his death and saw faces that carried their own secrets, their own guilts, their own fears about what his example might inspire. Any last words? The executioner asked. Solomon surveyed the crowd one final time, his gaze settling on the few slaves who had been permitted to watch. To them he smiled. Not the broken smile Caldwell had demanded, but something genuine and fierce and utterly free. "I lived as myself for one night," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "That's more than most men get." The rope went around his neck, rough hemp against skin that had known gentler chains. The trapdoor waited beneath his feet like an open mouth, but Solomon Carter felt no fear, only the strange peace that comes from completing an impossible task. The trap opened, and freedom fell. But legends don't die with the men who birthed them. Within days, stories began spreading through the slave network that connected plantation to plantation like underground rivers. Solomon Carter's name became a whisper in the darkness, a promise that monsters could bleed, that obsessions could be broken, that even the most powerless could find power when pushed beyond endurance. They said his spirit walked the fields at midnight, searching for children in danger. They carved his symbol into trees, stitched it into quilts, sang it into lullabies that sounded like prayers. In South Carolina, a house slave named Gabriel claimed to have seen Solomon's ghost the night before he poisoned his master's wine. In Alabama, field hands reported strange lights in the sky when a brutal overseer was found dead in his bed. The authorities tried to suppress the stories, whipped slaves caught repeating them, burned anything that bore Solomon's mark. But legends are harder to kill than men, and Solomon Carter's legend grew stronger with each attempt to destroy it. If this story stirred something in your soul, share it with those who need to hear that even the most broken spirit can rise. Subscribe to hear more untold stories of justice served cold and patient and absolutely final. Because some names refuse to be forgotten, some voices refuse to be silenced, and sometimes the only way to break an obsession is to become something more dangerous than the thing that tried to break you.